Today, the place was the quiet town of Montgomery, Alabama.
Somebody's asking how long will prejudice blind the visions of men.
We face, therefore, a moral crisis as a country.
Free at last! Free at last! Thank God Almighty! We are free at last!
Can't Look Away. Dialogues on photographs of the civil rights struggle. I know the world is bruised and bleeding, and though it is important not to ignore its pain, it is also critical to refuse to succumb to its malevolence. Like failure, chaos contains information that can lead to knowledge, even wisdom, like art. As our series continues, Kenyon College scholars delve deeper into the history and legacy of the civil rights movement through images of remarkable moments captured by photographers who witnessed the demonstrations for racial justice of the 1960s. Engaged with urgent issues of racist violence examined earlier in this series, this subsequent set of discussions helps us understand different modalities of Black Americans' resistance to oppression. These dialogues offer us views of courageous assertions of human dignity in the face of insidious and brutal racism, and highlight the unrelenting resiliency, strength, and beauty of African American culture and community. In this episode, looking at Bob Adelman's 1963 photograph of a Black woman awaiting voter registration in the segregated South, John Tazewell, Thomas S. Turgeon Professor of Drama at Kenyon College, speaks with Chaplain Rachel Kessler, priest in charge of Harcourt Parish, about how the pervasive myth of white purity impacts the daily lives of Black Americans, still to this day. Let's listen in.
It's been a year.
Truly, that is an understatement.
Yeah, it's been, but it's, I've really enjoyed the conversations that
Yes.
we've had.
I think we've had some really deep conversations.
Yeah, I think so. Well, I'm not really sure where we are heading. Actually, I was having a conversation. I'm in the midst of Crossroads, which I don't know if you kind of know what that is, and having some conversations with other faculty people about what is this?
Yeah.
What is this anti-racism thing, and what are we doing? Really, where are we going with this thing?
Well, I was kind of thinking, as I was walking over here, I was thinking about that, and I was doing a Bible study on Ecclesiastes with students this semester, and thinking about a time to build down and a time to tear down and a time to build up. And I feel like we're doing a lot of the dismantling and tearing down of things that need to be torn down in terms of white supremacy and the whiteness of this institution and the institution of the church. But knowing how to build something constructively, I think, is so much more challenging.
That's interesting. I mean, the first part, I'm not sure.
I'm not sure we're actually doing the tearing down. Maybe.
Well, I think we are, but I think that's the real question in some ways is how far can we dismantle to get where we need to be in order to begin that process of rebuilding. So, at any rate. So, we want to talk about this photo.
Let's talk about the photo.
It's such an interesting thing because this image is in some ways iconic, like an iconic representation of Jim Crow segregation.
Absolutely.
But that iconography, the fact that it's an icon in some ways, makes it, I think, almost forgettable, almost dismissible, because it, we know this exists. We know this is a part of our American history. We whether or not we have rejected that idea, really. That time has passed. We went through the civil rights era. We sort of said, okay, this is no longer a thing, right? People can drink from whatever water fountain they want to drink from, sort of. But I think the thing about this image that is so troubling to me, when I really think about it and think about the depth of the violence that it represents, is this idea that that the woman who's in that photo is really considered to be subhuman. And by extension, I'm considered to be subhuman, right? So this idea that my existence, it would somehow, or my consumption of the water in this fountain would somehow poison the water in a way that would make white people ill, sick, disgusted, whatever it might be, whatever that result might be, so that it isn't just a question of the supremacy, the white supremacy that sort of says, okay, well, we get to have these things and you don't get to have these things, or we get to have these certain things and you'll have to go around the back, or you'll have to go, to a different place or something in order to have yours, but you can have yours. And it's a kind of separate but equal idea. But the reality is that somehow my blackness, my existence, is so offensive in and of itself that it means that it literally will poison the water. And that suggests a kind of removal of my humanity. And that's really difficult to sort of unpack in some ways. How do I make sense out of that?
Yeah. Are there ways that you make sense out of it? How do you make sense of the woman in the photo? Because what strikes me when I look at this, right, is the white only so foregrounded, and the woman who's back in the shadows, and her personhood is obscured, right? You can't make out her face or anything about her as an individual human being. So how do you reconcile?
Well, that's sort of the lifetime of work.
Yes.
That I'm that I have been engaged in. And the photograph itself is brilliant in the way in which it uses composition in order to create that iconography, right? To as you said, foreground this sign about whiteness, and to push this black woman into the background, because it says very clearly, just through the composition, that's what America is. That's what America does. And that this is really just a representation of American society. And the real brilliance in some ways of this is, and I think this is what gets lost perhaps, is that that's actually what America still is. Even though the restriction, the whites only restriction on the water fountain is no longer really sort of legislated. It's not systematically or I guess formally still something that exists in our American society. The reality of the foregrounding of whiteness and the privilege of whiteness in society, and the backgrounding of everything else in American society, and again, this idea of pushing humanity, the humanity of everything else, away. That this, even if that door is now open, right? Even if the door is open, but the door in American society, racial door in American society, is a white door, right? It's a whites only door. And so now, in some ways, within the context of current American society, there's this idea that says you can walk through the door if you can be white. Mm-hmm. And so then the idea of that means, well, how does one do that, right? How does one who is not, who has skin color like me, do that? And that gets mitigated, and we get to this question of, well, so how do you assimilate into this society? So as long as you can play the part, you get to walk through the door. So it's still a whites only door. Mm-hmm. It's just that you have to be able to assimilate in a way that lets you play the part of that, and that lets you come into this sort of part of society. But that the recognition of my humanity is not a sort of a recognition of all of my humanity. It's only a recognition of my humanity as long as I can play the part that allows me to walk through the whites-only door.
And what parts of yourself are you required to obscure?
Absolutely. And always I am, right? Always I am required to leave those things behind and be acceptable, be safe, be someone that people feel is acceptable within whatever those definitions of society are. And even Americanness, right? What does it mean to be American? Because so much of what it means to be American, it gets conflated with whiteness, right? And so for me to be an American, even though obviously I've always been an American, but for me to be an American, I somehow have to assimilate into this understanding of what it means to be white and to be American, and that
great image of Main Street,
yeah,
right? Main Street USA,
yeah,
which then obviously raises whole questions of why Main Street USA is as white as it was, which then goes into redline, and there's just it's an unfolding layers of that whiteness.
Yeah. So let me ask you about your experience growing up, because I know that you struggle with this, and I'm really curious about it. I grew up in the North, and I did experience a great deal of racism even in northeastern Ohio. I mean, my parents, you mentioned redlining, my parents were trying to buy a house and move us into a bigger house and in a nice neighborhood, and continued for months and months and months to run into redlining as we were trying to find. We would call and make an appointment with the realtor, and inevitably we would arrive and hop out of the station wagon, and the realtor would meet us and say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, but somebody just bought the house." And when my parents finally decided that what they were going to do was buy a lot on a street and build a house, a group of people on that street tried to get together and purchase the lot out from underneath my parents to prevent us from building the house on that street. And we ultimately ended up doing just that, buying the lot and building the house, and it was a lovely place to live, and I enjoyed growing up and all of that stuff, but it was just fraught with all of these things, these obstacles that came before. So for you though, as you were growing up, what was that like, and what was, how did you recognize, or did you recognize some of those sort of things?
I feel like I've recognized them more in hindsight, right? As I have done more of my own, I hope, and ongoing anti-racism work, right? You start to put together pieces of your life. So I grew up mostly in the South Carolina, North Carolina, Southeast. And my parents' families are from Kentucky, Louisville, Kentucky, right? And you start to realize the house that my mom grew up in, that my grandmother still lives in, right? That they must have, my parents are classic baby boomers. So this is obviously a house bought right after World War II. And you start realizing, oh, right, these were those mortgages made available to middle-class white families that my grandparents were able to buy this house that other people probably would not have been allowed to buy, right? And you start seeing that play out and how that's impacted my family going on 3 generations now. And then I think about in high school, right? I mean, I went to public high school in South Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina, and probably a fairly even split. I mean, primarily white and black were the racial identities in the school, and a fairly even split, I would say. But looking back on it now, realizing how deeply self-segregated that school was. And being someone who was primarily in honors and AP classes, looking back at a school that had a pretty even racial divide and realizing how white my honors and AP classes were. I mean, it's just the pieces start coming together in really profound ways, and you realize how much, just as an individual being raised in this cultural context in this country that we're in, how much that really shaped my life, right? And then the other piece of this is my dad was a military chaplain. So my life is a little bit scattered because I lived different places. But the portion of my life spent living on military bases, you have a very clear class divide in terms of officer and enlisted, which is incredibly stark. And you look back again at the racial divides manifested there, and it's really overwhelming, I think, to see explicitly the racial dynamics of our country played out in my life,
Right.
and to do the work of owning that, right?
Yeah. So when I was a small child, and I made a film about this, and I'm older than you, so I was still a kid when a lot of the sort of the legacy of the civil rights movement, the civil rights movement was still actually very much in. We were in the midst of the height of that when I was a small child. And I recall when I was a kid that we would travel south from the north down to the south in order to go visit family. My father was from Portsmouth, Virginia. And my mother had gone to college in the South, in North Carolina. And so we had relatives who lived down there because a lot of the women in my family had gone to school there. And so we would go both to North Carolina and to Virginia to visit family. And in order to do that, of course, at that time we drove, and in order to do that, it was kind of a 2-day trip because a lot of the interstates had not fully been cut through, and it just took longer. And some of that might have been my dad. I don't know, maybe he didn't like to drive in the dark or whatever. But at any rate, we would stop in Breezewood, Pennsylvania. Okay. So I made this little movie about Breezewood, Pennsylvania because, I have this memory of Breezewood as a child and our fondness for this, way stop. And so in adulthood, I've sort of discovered a lot of other things about this. But Breezewood has this motto, which is the gateway to the South. And it's Breezewood, Pennsylvania is obviously in Pennsylvania, and it is just north of the Mason-Dixon line, which really is sort of like Cumberland, Maryland, or whatever. So it's just north of the Mason-Dixon line. Well, what that meant for me and my family was that we could stay at a motel in Breezewood, but if we crossed over the Mason-Dixon line, we then would be in a place where we weren't entirely sure that we could stay at a motel. So we might have to either find a place where we could stay, or we might have to drive all the way through. And so it just became much more tricky for us in trying to figure out how did we circumvent some of the segregation and Jim Crow stuff that was there. And we loved going to Breezewood, my brothers and I, because there were pools at the motels, and we would go to the motel and we would get to go swimming in the pool. And so we didn't really have any of the systemic stuff that was existing only sort of a few miles, really, in some ways, only a few miles away. And I didn't really recognize the negotiation that my parents were doing and the strategies that my parents were employing in order to avoid putting their children in this kind of difficult racial situation, that they were making this conscious choice to stop in Breezewood, because Breezewood is not that far, right? It's not really far enough in some ways. It's not that far from Akron, Ohio, to get to Breezewood, then to try to drive from there down to Portsmouth, the Norfolk Virginia or something like that. So why would you stop there? You'd think, well, why didn't we go to Washington D.C. or why didn't we go someplace else? But the reason was that it was a relatively safe, easy place to get to where we weren't going to have to deal with some of the systemic racial segregation that existed at that time, and they would avoid us really being aware of all of those kinds of Jim Crow era things that existed. Now, the civil rights laws had changed even at that point, but the reality of what existed in society versus what existed in legislation was different, right? So, the law said we could stay, but that didn't necessarily mean that we could. So we loved going there because we thought, this is great. This was perfect. It was a great vacation. And but my parents, of course, knew that they were actually making this really kind of strategic decision in order to prevent us from having to encounter that kind of racial segregation as we went. And then, of course, once we went into the South, we really were just staying within the sort of community and confines of our family, and that we weren't really engaging with the surrounding areas or anything like that. So I have a question for you about that in some ways. You have 2 small kids.
I do.
And how are you and Lehman talking to them about race?
I mean, so I have for the context of our folks watching this, I have a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old. So I mean, I think it was a conscious choice we made. So we moved here from Toronto, Ontario, which is an incredibly diverse. I would go as far as to say Toronto is one of the most racially diverse cities in the world. And
put that on my list.
It is. I mean, and then you unpack that, right? One of the reasons for that is the British Empire and colonialism, and it being a Commonwealth country, and it drawing immigrants from other. So I mean, it's a whole thing, right? I mean, the Anglican Diocese of Toronto that I came from was richly diverse, and yet, I was at a diocesan event. Sorry, I promise I'm answering your question. I was at a diocesan event one time. Of clergy, and someone asked how many for the clergy who were born in Canada to raise their hands, and it was just more than half, right? So I mean, you're talking about an immigrant communities and diversity and different languages, and great, different when you got outside of Toronto. In the Anglican Church of Canada. But I mean, we were raising we had 1 child at the time that we moved here, and we were in a community, in a context where there was great racial diversity, and being conscious of that, and knowing that we were going to move to rural Ohio, where by and large it is not as racially diverse, and really thinking through that decision and what we wanted the experience of our children growing up to be. So yeah, how do we talk? We try to expose them to as many books and media as we can that show a diverse range of people and racial identities. And especially this, with everything that's happened this past summer with George Floyd, with the Black Lives Matter movement, and our daughter being now 7 and being much more aware of what's going on in the world, really trying to talk about how what we've been trying to talk about is whiteness, right? To recognize that we are white and that there are people who will treat us a certain way because we are white, and we do have friends who have different racial identities, and to try to begin to unpack with her how other people's experiences of the world may be different based on what color their skin is, right? And in really very stark ways. It's hard to have those conversations with a 7-year-old, but trying to at least begin to open that up. And again, books, movies, things that we have to expose them to, right? Really trying to be conscious of that, right? What is the media that we're bringing into our home, even with little kid board books, and how one of my very favorite books is Archbishop Desmond Tutu has a book called God's Dream. I don't know if you know this book.
I don't think so.
It is one of my absolute favorite children's books, and we got it. I mean, we've had it for Amanda since she was 6 months or a year old. And it's, God has a dream that all of God's children will love each other and share each other no matter what color they are, no matter how they talk to God. There's one of the pages in the board book that has someone clearly on a prayer mat, someone who's clearly Jewish, right? And it talks about, all people being God's children and the vision for the world. But sometimes we don't live into God's dreams. Sometimes that we are cruel to each other. Sometimes we treat each other differently based on what color we are. And I feel like it's a really good way. It's a really good book for introducing kids. So that's one that's definitely been in our family library from the very beginning. He also has a children's storybook Bible, which also talks about children from around the world. So, I mean, I guess it's like as kids are really little, you try to lay a foundation of how we treat everyone. And then as they, as Amanda in particular has started to get older, unpacking the systemic issues, right? And how this isn't just about individuals, but starting to talk more about how the world has worked historically. I remember when she had, I think it was last year, Martin Luther King Day, when she was in school. I guess someone at the school had said that Martin Luther King was killed because, I forget exactly how she phrased it, but it was something that Martin Luther King was killed because people didn't like him or something. And we had to, and I don't remember how we actually handled the conversation, but we had to say, we had to start talking about, he was killed because he threatened this idea that white people are better than other people. So I don't know if that answers your question.
No,
they're hard
does.
conversations. They're hard conversations, and and one conversation. I mean, with my daughter in particular, going through period of dress. Right, little kids love playing dress up. Yeah, and it's a real question for us. Do we let when our 4-year-old is in a super Moana phase? Do you let your 4-year-old dress as Moana? Do you let your 4-year-old dress as Princess Jasmine?
Oh, wow, that's another whole conversation.
Right, it's a whole conversation, right? And I've had arguments with my friends, right? Kids love imaginative play. Do I want to tell my white daughter that she can't imagine herself as Moana? Because that seems problematic, right? To tell her that she can't empathize with a person of another racial identity. That seems weird.
Yeah.
But then trying to unpack the idea of we don't treat other people's cultures as costumes. I want to bring this into the present day, right? Because what strikes me about the white-only bit is when I look at this and the water fountain, I see Flint, Michigan, right?
Wow, yeah.
That's when you access to something as simple as water, and how we aren't living under Jim Crow anymore, and yet when we think about who has access to something as simple as water and the violence that white supremacy still enacts in our country, that's what I take away from this photo.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I think it's very difficult, I think now in this day and age for people, we talk about white privilege in a kind of general sense, and I hear a lot of people, not so much recently, but within the last few years, I hear people saying, I don't know what that is. I don't have white privilege. Just because I'm white doesn't mean that I have any privilege. And without seeing those kinds of privileges that exist. And so, this is a very sort of specific, okay, so here is, like you said, here's something fundamental to all humanity. Everybody needs water. Mm-hmm. But it's not just that kind of thing. It's all of these sort of systemic things where there is a certain kind of privilege that says access to what we think of as both needs and wants in American society is privileged, particularly for white people still over other people.
I have one final thing I'll wrap up with, because you were talking about the violence of this image, even though it's not the violence of lynch mobs, of Jim Crow, there is violence to this image. And there was something, so I've been reading a lot about the Titanic for reasons that I don't really know, but I've been reading a lot about the Titanic, and that there's the image in the James Cameron movie of the third-class passengers being held back behind the gate, right? The gate, yeah. But with the guy. And there's no evidence that that actually happened. The reality is they were under the decks and they had access to get up to the boats. Very likely, but they never had access to that, and they never went to that part of the ship before. And trying to navigate and figuring out how to get above deck.
Interesting.
From where they were segregated.
Right.
You know, and so you don't have to have the violence of the lynch mob to have is where I'm right. Like, there's a metaphor there for the way society is structured that keeps people below deck and keeps people out, and that much more insidious violence. I think is what you see in this image.